What could be, was that all situation? You could be all I ask for, always. We could be always on.
Hello, and welcome to another Minor Compositions podcast. Today, we're joined here by Ana Minozzo. Hi, Anna. How you doing?
Hey, Stephen, good morning. I'm good.
Thanks for coming along. And we wanted to invite you to talk about your new book, Anxiety as Vibration, a Psychosocial Cartography. And it's a really lovely book to talk about. I think in particular relationship to this series. I really enjoyed reading it. But the reason why it makes sense in the series is one thing I love about it is it's an open access book, which is always great for people to be able to read. And Minor Compositions as a book series is an open access book series started in 2009 with the first book we published being Precarious Rhapsody by Bifo, who is someone who shows up a few times in your book as well. So it kind of seems like it's already in the constellation of ongoing conversations and things and stuff. So cool. Maybe as a place to start, and as I was reading your book, which I quite enjoyed reading, is it reminded me of an article I read about 10 years ago by a group called the Institute for Precarious Consciousness. And this article called "We Are All Very Anxious," and they argue that each phase of capitalism has a dominant affect. So for instance, it used to be a long time ago that the dominant affect was misery. And then under Fordism, it changed to sort of like boredom. So there was security, but kind of a sort of boredom of everyday life. And then they argued that today the sort of dominant affect of our world is anxiety. Now, this is quite interesting because they talk about anxiety as kind of a barrier to organizing things, a barrier to radical politics, anxiety as a problem. Now, what I was struck by reading your book, and this is a big overall question, is I think you start with and maybe dwell with a more basic, but perhaps a more dangerous question, and that's where I want to start is, what can anxiety do? Like before we even get to, is anxiety a problem? What do we do with it? We always have to start with like, well, what is it, and what can it do for many different levels? So let's
Yeah.
start with that. So, Anna, what can anxiety do?
Well,
And
well.
if that's too big as a question, maybe we can start with sort of also what are some of the tools or approaches you bring along to even starting to chip away at that question?
hmm That's really great. It's so cool that you bring this article, which I read when I was doing this research too. And that's right. We experience anxiety as something quite paralyzing. There's this excess of excitement in the body and in the mind. People have racing thoughts. They get sick. They can't breathe. They can't digest. They sweat, but they can't really act. So it's interesting how we can definitely think about anxiety as something that tempers our capacity for political organizing because it inhibits us from acting. I departed from there. If you look at the numbers of diagnoses of anxiety, they are very high. And I wanted to dissect what produces a diagnosis, first of all. If it's just a matter of how, discourse works and the times that we live in, that a certain kind of psychopathology exists more than others, or if we are also told to diagnose certain things more than others, what's behind all of that? So I tried to understand what was behind this understanding of we're all very anxious. Okay, so what's causing that? But according to what parameters? Have we been less or more anxious before at other times? So that already also opened up the conversation. But the gist of the book is that anxiety is about rupture.
Mm.
Something breaks. It's unbearable, it's difficult. And whenever we talk about psychopathology, to use that psychology word, we're talking about people suffering. So you can't lose sight of that. It's not fun. It's not cool. People don't experience those things because they want. It's a struggle. And for some people, it's really difficult. And still, is that it? Is our only hope to just not act, to medicalize, to try and take resource to treatments that individualize anxiety even more? And I think politically, I find that lame, that can't be just it. So what? So we just stay paralyzed. Is there anything in this affect that is so present in our times that could rupture into something else? So I went into psychoanalysis to think about this, because psychoanalysis has a very close history with anxiety. In fact, the first psychoanalytic texts were about anxiety. It's it's a practice that has informed a lot of the early 20th century understanding of what anxiety is about, which, because psychoanalysis lost a lot of its influence in the field of hegemonic psychiatry and psychology after the 1970s, that also got a bit lost. But in the beginning of the 20th century, psychoanalysis was the main discourse. And the key takeaway from that, which I go on to problematize later, because of course psychoanalysis is not just perfect, it's full of problematic assumptions too. But the one takeaway from that is that in psychoanalytic texts, from the very beginning, and the different orientations, the different times, these affects, they are not the problem. So whatever symptom we have, for example, it's not the issue itself, as if I'm here and I'm producing a symptom and it's my problem to fix it. And therefore I go to the doctor to get rid of that production, because that's meaningless and is just unproductive and not cool to have. Psychoanalysis thinks of it very differently. Not only anxiety is fundamental, it's part of our psychic operations. It's part of our capacity to negotiate our borders in the world with ourselves and what's outside of it, the excesses in and out of ourselves. But it's also our reaction to danger, to, the fight or flight kind of instinct. Freud talks about that. And so in the psychoanalytic approach, you tend to listen to these productions, these affects, the symptoms, to listen and think, okay, what is this about? What is this saying? What's happening that this affect is being produced? And when you invite that question, you're not individualizing it. You're thinking about a subject that is relational from the beginning. It's not a subject that is just biological. Oh, it's because in your brain, it's lacking this substance, whatever. It's already about something that is being produced in relation to being in the world with others. But of course, that relationality can go both ways in psychoanalysis. It can be ultra-conservative, assuming that there's a model of families, of desire, of identities that is there and it's necessary to avoid even more suffering. Or it can be pretty radical. And psychoanalytic discourse lives in this tension and has been living in this tension. And Freud, if we go back to his texts, he has those moments of being so radical, so progressive, but also being so misogynistic, so colonial, It's just the tension. And every time he says something, he goes and says, oh, it's not really that. So he changes his mind the whole time, leaving something always open to vibrate further. So I went to psychoanalysis, but I wanted to be feminist about it. Just really think about this mode of relationality that we assume that are producing subjectivity, Can they be not Oedipal? Can they be not relying on this family unit of, Western capitalism? Can we just think about a post kind of patriarchal possibility there? And so I tried to think about anxiety as this rupture that is connected to a context in our experience, that is about where we are in the world, but to think about this relationality, stretch it, with feminist allies. And by feminist allies, I'm thinking of feminist scholars, like necessarily, especially one that I think with quite a lot, Rosie Braidotti, who is this post-Deleuze and feminist. His work on ecology and politics I find tremendous. But in my way of thinking, even with Deleuze and Guattari, Franco Berardi, all these other allies, that perhaps they're not necessarily feminist theorists, but I think that they have a lot of feminist insight, because they're thinking about different modes of relationality that are not about power and castration to hold anything in place. They're expanding from that. So I mobilized these allies to think about, okay, this rupture of anxiety, can we do something else with it? What can it take us towards what? That's more or less my starting point.
Well, it seems to me that there's okay, I'm going to say there's two different layers here. There's probably a lot more that I'm not thinking of. And if one layer you have almost like the sort of changing status or sort of rates or diagnosis of anxiety and over time, and then you have almost like a second layer of like how anxiety is thought of in an analytic framework, how almost like the tool or framework used to address it, and how these two things then fit together, right?
Yeah.
And then that's the moment of you're calling it like that moment of tension where it can go in different ways, where it can go to you can have a quite very conservative interpretation, or you can have one that addresses, let's say, these moments of panic or anxiety as potential ruptures in a, I don't want to say positive way, because that sounds a little bit strange, but maybe it's a bit like there's one point where Bifo talks about like necessary forms of alienation, where the alienation gets you somewhere where it's like unpleasant, but it actually ends up being helpful in the long run. So it's almost like anxiety, which goes to sort of how can you engage with the rupture as a moment of, I guess you might say, becoming, rather than a moment of like a just problem to be dealt with, or particularly just biomedicalized.
Yeah, that's such a good point there with Bifo. He's really present in the work. And to diverge a little bit, one preoccupation that I had in the book was to read texts closely, so we could find the more radical potential in these texts. And I think that those things are not a given with Freud. Definitely it's not. With Lacan, which is the other kind of main psychoanalytic discourse that I'm thinking with, there's a lot of, especially nowadays, a lot of really problematic Lacanian analysts and scholars that that are extremely transphobic and say lots of crap and justify it in the text. So I went to the text to see if the text can say something else. But I would say the same for Deleuze and Guattari too. And with Bifo and with Rosie Braidotti, the fact that they don't lose sight that what Deleuze and Guattari were doing in their work together and separately was to think about the possibilities of life and not of an omnipotence. So when you're thinking about affect and connections and multiplicity, it's not this kind of unbound, omnipotent everything, which is a very kind of masculinist fantasy, very colonial fantasy. And there's a lot of readings of those texts that kind of go that way. They become anti-ecological, they become anti-feminists. And what I think Bifo gets right, and the feminists also get right, is that this understanding of affect, beyond consciousness, bodily encounters, matter, it's ethical in the sense that makes life possible. So it's about the encounter with others, always. You know, it's not about me being this multiple, expanded being. It's about being with the other and being with others all the time. And I think, I wonder if that's what Bifo is saying, just there in that moment too. But of course, sometimes it's unbearable. Not sometimes, all the time it's unbearable to exist just as, you know, this big rhizome. And we have this moments of crystallizing into something, a little delineation of who we are, which is important. Also, I think from a feminist perspective, it invites us to a sense of responsibility. You know, that moment that you are in the world and you have some sort of awareness of that. And what are you doing in this encounter? As long as that delineation is not stiff, as long as that's not the only way that needs to be guaranteed, that in psychoanalytic parlance, the kind of ego has to be stable, strong, in order for you to have any kind of ethical possibility with the other. Is this kind of like post-Kantian delirium, you know, that you need a subject to be able to have responsibility and ethics. And I think Bifo and Redotti and our several allies that I think are in dialogue with us, and I think a lot of the books and minor compositions has published throughout the years, we're not thinking that way. It's about this porous state of being in the world, you know, where we can alienate a little bit, because we do. We can take some sort of consistency, but that's not necessary, not by any means necessary, you know? And if we think about that model of subjectivity, then this rupture becomes something else. So it's rupture that is not a threat to your possibility of existing, but it's a rupture that points at something else, at precisely this porosity, this encounter with the other. So yeah, I think it's a really serious philosophical question, but I try to always be in touch with the clinic, because I think, yeah, clinical texts sometimes they miss this point, you know, that what is really at stake, I think, politically in some assumptions.
One of the things you argue, and I quite like this, so maybe see if you could unpack a little bit, is you talk a bit about treating anxiety not as a symptom, but as an affect. So can you maybe sort of explore a little bit more about what that distinction, what that distinction does for you, treating anxiety as an affect rather than as a symptom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really cool question, and it's really it's in Freud and Lacan already from the beginning. And if you think it's not a symptom, but an affect, it's makes it more part of our life. You know, it's not something that we can remove or live without. And it wouldn't even be interesting to remove and live without that. It's like having a life without all these other ranges of emotions. Imagine, like, no frustration, no fear, nothing that is just joy and happiness. Then perhaps we would be in this static sense with no possibility of transformation. So already there, by not thinking of it as a symptom, there's a possibility of not pathologizing it and wanting to remove it, but to be able to live with it in a different way. Of course, it's not about asking people to live with anxiety attacks, with panic attacks, with extreme anxiety every day, because that's terrible and paralyzing. But to be able to have a little bit of anxiety, and that being part of their existence in a way that doesn't make them crumble each time. So also, if we think about an affect, it's interesting that it's something that really ties psyche and body. It's not just body and it's not just psyche. And again, that's something to think about. It's not a production that is, but in psychoanalysis, symptoms are always like that too, you know. So yeah, I don't think I'm answering this very well. But
Your answer,
yeah, go
sort of reminds me of, I remember when I was a kid, my grandmother was very religious, and she would always talk about heaven as a place where there's like, it's very angelic, and there's like angels playing harps and everything is great. And my thought was that sounds horrible. Like a state where everything is good but nothing ever changes would like maybe be nice at first, but would become almost like sheer suffering by the fact that nothing ever changes and it's always just kind of
Totally. Yeah, this kind of homostatic state. No stimulus, no encounter with difference. I think that's something that is important also when we think about affects in a feminist, even in a decolonial kind of way, ecological way, because it's not affect as encountering with others that are the same and will, by this encounter, maintain some sort of status quo, even if it's this fantasy of being multiple and rhizomatic and whatever. It's precisely this encounter with others that are different.
mm,
And so homostasis is not going to happen. There is going to be stimulus, difference as this encounter of something else and a life that is changing and is producing something else. And it's an invitation each time. Nothing just stays the same. And if we think about it in this way, anxiety, because it's something that is so common, is an effect of rupture. It's one that really destroys these fantasies of homostasis that we are. Oh, and I'm here delineated, and people that are outside me, they're also static, and everything is just as is. Our experience of something changing, rupturing, almost like we have this little imaginary, bubbles that is our experience of ourselves. The way we can experience that is very limited. We are much more than what we are aware of each time. But anxiety is something that touches that bubble, the walls of that bubble. And as Guattari says, is this bird tapping on the window.
mm.
And what are we gonna do? Close the window, double glaze it, kill the bird. There's many things that are done all the time, and more and more. And I think you also think about the UK context. It's such a charged affect. If you think about what's been offered to people in the last few years in terms of care, it's about killing the bird and double glazing the windows more and more in an insufficient way. Oh, you're anxious, it's your problem. If you're unemployed, if there's racial violence, if there's a genocide, here it is, it's a pill. You take it, and maybe you can have 6 sessions and you do some homework. And if you haven't managed, clearly it's your problem, because here are the data saying that should work, and not only takes all the value of thinking about rupture in a political way and inviting us to think about what shouldn't stay the same, as a reaction of things that are a lot of the times not okay, but also adds this extra failure onto people that you are not feeling good because this technique should really work, instead of opening up like a more exploratory way of thinking about what they're experiencing. So yeah, I also wanted to not lose sight of that, just be in the philosophical discussion in the book, but thinking about the repercussions of it. Okay, what are people getting? So why do we really need to think about anxiety and this phenomenon of something that, the statistics that we have is that 20% of the population could be diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder, not just feeling anxious here and now, but having a pathological kind of anxiety, something extra. That's a lot, 20% of the population in the US and the UK, and it's a fifth of the population. So what else? What else can we do? What else can we offer? What are people being offered,
I mean, in a way that strikes me as kind of I guess you might call the pernicious element of use of psychology, where you take a response to, let's say, people are anxious or angry about conditions, whether in the workplace or generally socially, and then rather than saying, let's think about what's causing these, it's saying, oh, your anxiety and angers are your problem. Let's give you some online CBT sessions, and you can manage those things yourself rather than thinking about what produces them and how they might be produced differently or lead to a different outcome or a different relationship.
Totally. Yeah. And of course, like this is not for us or whomever to moralize people who individually are feeling super overwhelmed and go to their GP and just get go to their local therapy center and just get what they need because that's what they're offered. It's not about that, people that take lots of psychic medications and do CBT and they're just trying with what they have. It's not about, moralizing individual choices in that way, but about thinking of the systems of care and the effects of these discourses on how we relate to our own effects. Because if we're told that this is our problem, if it can be resolved quick, if it's an individual weakness, if it's a disorder to feel that way, that limits our experience of this affective rupture too. We don't have conditions to think that it could produce something else. So this kind of the effect of discursivity onto our experiences every day. There is that too to think about. And it's interesting that psychoanalysis, I'm fully aware of how uncool it can be. And it's with a lot of reason to be very uncool. Psychoanalysts, they really don't help themselves sometimes, But there is there's definitely this renewed interest. There was this article, I think it was in the New York Times last year, and it was like, not your daddy's Freud, that talked about this like new wave of especially younger people thinking psychoanalytically and going back to psychoanalysis after engaging with all these ready-made answers, with these quick fixes, with this flattening of our subjective experiences, with the erasure of the political landscape from thinking about psychopathology, and going back to psychoanalysis and thinking, okay, actually, I'm in the world and things are interconnected with this experience. And if we get the best of psychoanalysis there, this idea of the normal and the pathological, it's much more progressive. There's no normality or pathology in that way. There is suffering, there's symptomatic production, and you go to analysis to hopefully relieve some of that is, paralyzing you in some ways. But you go to analysis to find a way of living, and you don't know what that's going to be like. And your analyst has no clue either if they're good, if they're not like those conservative analysts. Some of them, they do think that they know how you should live. So I think it's important for us to, again, go back to the text. I'm a big fan of going back to the text and seeing, hang on, is the original text really that bad? Perhaps we could read it differently. What are what I called in this book, the vibrational moments of this canonical texts? Because then, okay, we can be very rigorous as psychoanalysts. And I'm lucky to be around so many psychoanalysts that are very rigorous. They really know what they're talking about. But they engage with these texts in a radical, politicized way, rather than, justifying a terribly violent position with the same text.
One of the things I read last year that I was really impressed by, and you quote it a few times, is the book Disalienation by Camilla Robsis. And I was reading at that point because I was reading a lot of Deleuze and Guattari, and I was interested in understanding particularly Guattari's work, not just going into the text, which is very important itself, but also sort of how the text and the concepts are very rooted in his work at Laborde and how they come directly out of that. And that it's super interesting on that level. But also one of the things I was most struck by in the book was the chapter on Fanon in relation to institutional therapy. And the thing that was really lovely about it is, one, I had never thought about Fanon in relation to institutional therapy. But so you have this interesting thing where he's trained at St. Albans, and then he goes to Algeria, and then he realizes all the tools and methods he's developed in institutional therapy in France, like they don't work as well in Algeria because they're attuned to the needs and the desires and the expectations of a certain population, namely European females. And so he's finding that his methods aren't working for the local male population. So he has to sort of like think about, how do I change what I'm doing to this context? And I find it really interesting, and not just sort of repeating things, but also sort of how do you shift them such that they work with in the place you are now.
Yeah, yeah, totally. This, by the way, that Camille Robs's book, Disalienation, if anyone hasn't read it yet, is such a good book. It's one of the first English language books about, that whole wave of radical psychoanalytic political movements in France, which a lot of the work is still not translated, for example. So she's done such a good job, and the book is such a good read as well. Yeah, really delicious to read, Yes, we could think about in a very Guattarian way of the polyvocity of the unconscious, which is the word that he would use it, how it's not about meaning making in this triangular way or this dialectical way that meaning is produced. The meaning is more multiple than that. So if we are thinking about an unconscious that is more multiple, then we have to be able to listen to that in a different way too. It's not about interpreting, as classic psychoanalysis for a long time would do, as if there is a frame of reference that is common, and you're always in relation to that. There's a subject that has been castrated, and you're trying to figure out what's happening there. But to think otherwise, and of course, that invites you to refigure your clinical technique, your dispositif. That's what in Saint-Aubin and Laborde they did. They invented different ways of thinking about the unconscious. And of course, that was out of necessity because they were working with psychosis. And in the clinic of psychosis, like the clinic of kids, of children, you have to be very creative because you are encountering immense creativity in ways of being that, with a lot of suffering too, but ways of existing that you have no idea what's going on. So you can't depart as a clinician from the point that you would know. And yet, how can you work? Not being the one that knows anything about what's going on, but inviting the production of something else. My current research, which it's very informed by this book, of course, but it's not related to anxiety anymore. But my current research is on free psychoanalytic clinics in Latin America. And the word that they use a lot there in the region is the word territory. And I love that because that is a word that comes from, there's a Brazilian Black geographer called Milton Santos that has this beautiful theory of the territory as a space of production of futures. But also, it comes, I think, from the public health vocabulary, because in Brazil, the mental health, public health system is formed after the dictatorship. And there was a movement of mental health workers, like a social movement of people that got together, and they created what mental health care would be like. And people like Guattari, they visited Brazil, Basaglia, a lot of the radicals of the time, they were in this dialogue. So actually the Brazilian psychiatric reform is pretty schizoanalytic in its own way. So there's uses of words territory, and care is really embedded in the territory, whilst here, the word we use in the UK is community. You have the community mental health care services. And whilst community and the commons is a great word too, territory brings us into something else. Perhaps that it's beyond just me and you and people that are the same somehow, but a mode of production of life that is situated. And I think if we think about what Fanon experienced of having to adapt into that territory, because life is being produced in a way that is situated and always is situated. It invites us to think about the unconscious productions in a creative way and not have a clinic for the sake of its own dispositif. It's not psychoanalysis or clinical care or practice for the sake of doing that right, but to think about that encounter, what is happening to the people that you're working with. You adapt the technique rather than just impose the technique, which is what Fanon did. And it's what a lot of younger practitioners have been doing in Latin America in such a cool way. But that requires us to think about the psychoanalytic texts, about psychopathology. It requires a philosophical nuance, in thinking about what is care, what is treatment. Is it a manual like we have, in some forms of therapy, that you get a book and you just have a workbook, you train on that, and you give that, you administer that, and that should work for everyone all the time in any context. That's very different utopias, I guess, of care.
The desire to find the one best method that works without context is basically the main falling error of basically all management theory, to be honest. But one thing that frustrates me a lot, and I think the mistake gets a lot made in sort of theoretical writing, is it's using your phrasing, neglecting the relationship between the concept and the territory. So, for instance, take a notion like transversality, right? It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes out of like understanding patterns of transference in a particular context, where it's not just about like the conceptual concept of transversality, but it's also like, how do you arrange the workings of the clinic at the board, and the roles and who's doing what in order to have different patterns of transversality. So there's always something that's lost when you forget that relationship between the concept of the territory, that comes out of a particular place and reflects those relations and intervenes in them.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. And what I think I try to think about in this book, not enough, because I think that's like one's life work, is how to think about this transversality, which is an ecological mode of thinking, right? You're thinking about that subject as materially entangled in the world. It's a subject of the world, not in the world. Like, you're not this alienated phenomenological thing just there, but you're part of it. Your body's formed by the world too. And so it's an entangled subject. How to think of that in situations of clinical practice that are not in group settings, and not in a clinic that is big, but in what happens most often, that people come to one-to-one spaces of therapy. How do we, retain the potential of this transversal practices when people come here to my house feeling shit, overwhelmed, trying to find a way to even start talking, because that is not a given, and they're trying to even find a place where they can even listen to themselves. So how do you retain that in this one-to-one? Not necessarily that it has to be one-to-one, but also could it be one-to-one? That's something that I'm very curious about, and always interested in. What does it do? Perhaps it's about repositioning the position of the therapist, the analyst. What are we there for? Are we there as an expert? Are we there as a blank screen? How much of us? And of course, there's a big tradition in psychoanalysis, especially in the UK, of thinking about this notion of countertransference, which, instead of being what is brought from the patient into the room, is what the analyst is bringing. Like, if you feel all sorts of things, if you have any thoughts. And there's a whole web of practitioners that work with this countertransference as if it's their compact, thinking, oh, I don't know, you walk in and like, Stephen, I'm feeling that you're a bit reluctant today, this kind of things. And in a more Guattarian way, but even in a Lacanian way, I find that difficult, because that's still presupposing that we are connected to the same point of reference somehow, that my emotional responses have some truth about your world. And I don't think that that is sufficient if we think of radical differences. How do we build ethical relations within radical difference. You know, if you think about a world where we occupy, I don't know, different cosmologies even. We can, you know, we can even be of the same demographic, tick, 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 but we have no idea about the other. But how can we establish an ethical form of relationality, of care, of treatment, whatever? Not losing sight of that, not wanting to repeat. So not something about identification or, you know, one transcendental that is meant to be universal, like the master signifier for us all. Because those things are problematic. They have, you know, philosophical, political effects. So I'm curious about that. And I try to instead of thinking about countertransference in that way as the key to be alive in the room, to then bring this other term called co-poiesis. So the poetic production of something together. Yeah, and that was really like a little creative exercise because that is certainly not a psychoanalytic thing. Yeah, it's not in the text. It's just here and there. It's spread in all these works. And I tried to bring it together as, okay, so this is what we do. You know, that was I think the proposal of, okay, instead of just being really theoretical, okay, what can be done?
I have to admit that I'm not super familiar with the histories you're talking about sort of community clinics in Brazil, aside from having read that book that Guattari did with Sueli Rolnick on micropolitics in Brazil, which is really lovely. And I was just reading the last book of Sueli's that got translated into English. I'm blanking the title, but what you're talking about, but this relationship to the territory, kind of reminds me of the work done by people around Franco Basaglia in Italy in the 70s, and attempting to sort of negate the institution and move it to being almost like a transversal function in the community, which I quite like. So is that a similar kind of experience? And maybe just to add to that, because it also reminded me of I was reading this is now very random. I was reading a book by Tobias Jones about Italian football ultras, and in the 70s. And one thing he says, almost as an aside, in the wake of the Basaglia law passing, that many people left institutions, and football ultra communities started to function de facto as mental health support networks. So it's almost like thinking, like, could you have something that even seems not psychoanalytic at all, like football supporters network, come to function schizoanalytically as a kind of quasi, I don't even say therapeutic, but as a sort of as a territorially based, support structure.
Yeah, this is such a cool thing that you just shared about football. I'm a football fan, so I enjoy that one very much, and I'm going to definitely read that. Well, this is a big discussion. I don't go into it in this book in particular, but it's a little, it hints at this genealogy a little bit of the Basaglia and the institutional psychotherapy. In Brazil is interesting, and in my more recent work, I'm encountering this. This all collides because you have the Basalians, you have the Guattarians, you have young psychiatrists that go and work at Laborde, and you have these different kind of approaches, which are so similar and yet so different. Is it about negating any institution or transforming it? I personally think that there is space for different institutions, that sometimes, especially in the world that we live in, where relationships to space, to private property, to the city are the way they are, there is space for types of institutions that are not persecutory and violent. And sometimes, at Laborde, as you know, it's still open, and there are people that live there for 30 years. And some close colleague of mine from Brazil, our comrade Anderson Santos, he was just there. He's a Guattarian Tosqueas translator. He was just there last winter, and really thinking about this. There is space for a place where we can be together and get care, and sometimes take some time too. You need to get out of your house sometimes, or you need to get a house. So I think there is space for some sort of type of institutions for care, but of course, non-violent ones. But if we take Guattari very seriously, psychoanalysis, and I love when he says that, doesn't own the unconscious. Psychiatry doesn't own the unconscious. Psychology doesn't own the unconscious. Nobody owns the unconscious. The unconscious is there. So there's modes of assembling it, of the word they use is agenciament, just this. Yeah, I think assembling it would be the translation that could happen in any sort of forms of collectivity. I think if we think of rupture, and then again, the point there is that it's something that we can't rupture alone. It's a rupture always towards the encounter with the other. So forms of collectivity that are not based on identification necessarily, but that accommodate singularity and accommodate this production of new modes, they are, of course, very quote unquote therapeutic in so many ways. I think definitely, and perhaps the most interesting things happen outside of spaces of care as such, of the psi fields, football, music, different types of getting together, activism, and so on. I think there is space there, but so long as there is a space for creativity and singularity. So they're not groups, as Freud describes the groups that are just united by an ego ideal and require a relationship to a master. Because those groups, sometimes in football you have that, groups based on identification, I think they can be very unproductive too. So what kinds of forms of collectivity that are held together by something else? I think common collectivity. To go back to, I think Jean-Louis has his work on the collective, which is super great. And I heard some colleagues are translating it really soon into English, doing a whole collection on Jean-Louis' writings. That's going to be really cool because that work is really important, I think, if we think about the commons organizing. What does he understand about the collective? And he proposes that the collective is a machine to treat alienation.
I suppose that's why you have in the board and also many other places, not just what we see as normally as therapy, but also people making a newspaper, doing a radio show, doing stuff in the garden. It's all these different forms of interaction, which I suppose are part of producing what you I think think of as vibrational moments. So maybe can you sort of unpack a little what you mean by the idea of what is a vibrational moment and how does it come out of the encounter?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point that you made there. So the vibrational moment, the word that I used is just as a conceptual choice. So I chose a word to talk about something that maybe other types of scholarship or other forms of seeing things would call something else. But it's about affect and encounter with the other. I take this word from the work of Sueli, Ronick, and Deleuze and Guattari because that's where she also is in dialogue with. And actually, one chapter of the book, I search through Deleuze and Guattari's all their work, what they talk about vibration, what are they on about? What is this? And it's a moment where this porosity of ourselves becomes very apparent. And our being of the world really becomes apparent. The other in me, the me in the other, as something that is and can't be, is not a choice, that we are entangled. We are entangled, otherwise we can't breathe. There's no life if not entangled. We can be alienated from that in those moments that we forget. And we build all these discourses of about what humans are all about and the psyche is all about. But the fact is that it is, life is entangled. So these vibrational moments are this encounters with life as entangled, encounters with the others in radical difference. So I take this conceptual artifice, this object, to look through texts, almost, as a filter. Like I put a filter, the vibrational filter on this canonical texts to think, okay, if psychoanalysis offers us something that is important in the current mental health sphere, because the mental health landscape is grim. People are feeling horrible, and they're being treated in ways that are making them feel worse. And we know this because it's been decades of over-medication, and things are getting worse and worse. And there's all this data, and I've exposed the data. It's there. The psychoanalyst can contextualize our symptoms, our suffering, our affects, and propose that we engage with them to find a new way of living. And I find that interesting and cool and radical. All right. So is it any kind of psychoanalysis, or we need to actually get psychoanalysis to speak of life as this entangled production? Speak about our encounter with others as something of the matter of life, and not about recognition, competition, castration, power. Because I'm not interested in that. And I think in psychoanalysis, Lacan is full of that. Half of his work, well, not half, maybe 2/3, is super Hegelian, and no offense to the Hegelians out there, but no, thank you. As a feminist, I find that so not just insufficient, but extremely problematic. And feminists have been spitting on Hegel for 50 years because that's not enough. You can't assume a rest. You can't assume a frame that is going to always be the frame of reference of something. There's modes of living that reinvent themselves outside the frames of power. And that's what life is. And so this vibrational moments, it was this filter that I've used. So instead of thinking of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic discourse as the truth, because a lot of psychoanalytic scholars, they do that, as if what's in Freud is all truth, or as if it's in Lacan is all truth, and then you kind of patch up. Oh yeah, let's be a little decolonial now. What is this feminist entangled reality of life? Either we think of life in this way, or we are alienating something fundamental there. Is psychoanalysis sufficient to think about it in this way? And so I went to the text to find these moments where life is entangled, where the relationship to the other is not about recognition, not about not about identification, but about radical difference, producing something else. I don't know if that makes any sense, if I just got a bit convoluted.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things I really like about the way you talk about vibrational moments, and also the way you talk about anxiety, is basically one of the things they share is being a possible way to sort of get out of, or I think what you call the sort of individualizing residues found within certain forms of psychoanalysis. So you're always trying to, with the tendency to rather than to stay with the entanglement, to say, no, let's shove it back to the subject. Let's shove it back to the individual. And that's almost like it's almost like forcing the dynamic back into a little box rather than staying with the entanglement, staying with that complication, because that's where we live in the complication, not in the little self-contained box of self.
Totally.
In fact, if anything, trying to stay in the self-contained box of self is probably part of the problem,
Totally, yeah. And when you go so in the book, I read all of Freud texts on anxiety, all of Lacan texts on anxiety, which was cool to do in a strange, nerdy way. And hopefully, that was one of the things that I really wanted, to make those things kind of more, I think, just easier for people to, especially Freud is cool to read, but Lacan is horrible, it's just so, it's not fun. It's not easy. It's so inaccessible. It's so full of jargon. So I just wanted to also make that available for people that are thinking of this text. You don't have to read 10 books on this nonsense, but to be able to engage with it in a way that is radical too, So that was an attempt that I had done in the book too. But if you go, especially in those chapters, you see that that's what they do. Psychoanalysis is always trying to close down. And that's what Guattari says. And he uses that sentence that psychoanalysts are always trying to tend to the ornamental garden of psychoanalysis. which is just it's so against the unconscious, because the unconscious is anything but ornamental. The unconscious is like a forest full of activity. Everything is happening. It's not a little ornamental garden. And in the texts from the beginning, Freud does that. There's always this opening and closing, opening and closing. And then we can choose. We can stay with the closing and having a very neat little theory and coming to your fancy office and tell people that what they're suffering is because of mommy and daddy, and that you need to castrate them and or whatever else, and talk about people ways of desiring, of identifying, or whatever, as pathological as a lot of analysts do. Nowadays you have analysts that they have really like a really big beef with trans people at the moment. They've always had, but at the moment they're just obsessed with it. They just cannot handle it. It disrupted something fundamental for those psychoanalysts. They just can't stop. They're obsessed. So you can choose to do that and pathologize ways of being, or you can choose to be with the opening moments of psychoanalysis. And they are there. And a lot of psychoanalysts do that too. So no ornamental garden, but like the forest of psychoanalysis.
Perhaps a glib way to talk about the shift in your work, which I think might be partially true, it would say your thrust is sort of like enough ornamental gardens. How about more community gardens?
Yeah, edible community garden would be cool. Yeah, that would be great.
Maybe we could use that as a nice segue to start talking about sort of what you mean by this idea of copoiesis in the creative clinic, which might actually be a community garden.
Totally. It's totally a community garden. I love that. Yeah, so copoiesis, again, is just a term that emerged in the work. Again, like this, which I think is a Deleuze thing too, of, using concepts to be able to think in a different way, like the liveliness of concepts, and not being, not so worried about the genealogy of being precise about what the concept means, but to use them for something, for air to circulate. And that's a word that I saw here and there in different iterations, with different spellings, in different places. And then I saw that was actually something that I wanted to communicate about this position of what happens in the clinical encounter. So Guattari was inspired by the work of these two Chilean scientists from the 70s, Varela and Maturana, who had this idea about cells being little motors of production of life. It's like a question of scale, not like thinking about an organism, but thinking about each cell as a little life-producing motor. And they call that autopoiesis, how there is a generation of life in each cell. And it's a really cool, I think for political organizing, it's a really cool way of thinking. And Guattari was like, yeah, I love that. But maybe it's not so short-circuited. And he writes that like in brackets, like, but I mean that in a different way, because he's incorporating the outside. He's incorporating the other in this process of subjective production, because that's what he was seeing at Laborde. It's not that each person there was generating life alone. It's a capacity of life production that is always with the other. It can't be autopoiesis, but he used the word autopoiesis. He doesn't say copoiesis or sympoiesis. Rosie Braidotti talks about that too at some point. She's like, well, Guattari uses autopoiesis, but he's talking about it being a collective type of life production. Donna Haraway will use sympoiesis as her word. And I love how that relates to, ecofeminist theory, especially this theory of Lynn Margulis, this evolutionary biologist, this woman who is the proponent of the Gaia hypothesis. So, of course, she was a woman, and she became less famous than Lovelock, who was the guy who was a bit off sometimes. He created this idea of the Gaia hypothesis with her. But she was disputing the idea of how life evolves with the neo-Darwinists in the 70s and 80s. And the neo-Darwinists, obviously, especially in the 70s and 80s, they are very they were very connected to the economical discourses of, neoliberal imaginations, competition, strongest survives, whatever. And she was like, oh, no, actually, I'm looking at this cell here. And if you look at it really closely, there's no life alone. Life is symbiotic. That's the paradigm of life, a symbiosis. It's not competition. And obviously, she was much less famous than all the neo-Darwinists of her time. But that's the root of the Gaia hypothesis. So Donna Haraway will think about that. So you think about the symbiosis, the sympoietic, you think about the collective autopoiesis. There's another analyst called Braha Ettinger that uses the word copoiesis as well in her work, and her work is super poetic because she has this funny way of using words that it's brilliant, very complex. So this was something that was all around, and I saw it everywhere in the artwork of Ligia Clark, this Brazilian artist that towards the end of her life started doing this kind of therapy session as her art practice. And I use that as as my little metaphor to be able to hold this really abstract discussion into place. So this capacity of producing something together with the other that none of you knows what it's going to be about yet, but you try and produce that ethically, in difference, and assuming that life is about entanglements. So that's the copoiesis, and trying and thinking about that in the clinical encounter was something that I've started in this book. And of course, this speaks to an attempt of thinking about care as ecological. So if you try and thinking about like a more kind of ecological, especially ecofeminist possibility of care, that's where, I'm still thinking about that in the current work, and we'll see where it gets to. But I think there's something that helps me every day there.
It sounds to me like there's kind of like a similar move being here of like, in the same way that you don't want to fall back in that tendency to shove the dynamic of anxiety back into the little box of the subject, you also don't want to shove the clinic back into the box of a very narrow territory. So it's like trying to work with these different forms of entanglement and how they vibrate, which is super cool.
Mhm.
But so and this is a very basic question, but then how would sort of copoiesis relate to what Maturan and Varel talk about as allopoiesis?
What do you mean?
Well, because sorry if I'm getting it wrong, but allopoiesis is not the sort of self-organized production of the same, but the production of difference, right?
Mhm.
And to my mind, staying with those forms of entanglement would be almost like staying with the production of difference or
Yeah. I think the collective, the common, the collectivity comes into play there. And and that's really interesting, because if you think about the unconscious as if you're thinking about this, if it's my own repository if it's my own little forest, then you could think about something that is autopoietic. And that happens in the psychoanalytic clinic all the time. You go to the analyst and you go to your own little forest that you were a little bit alienated from already. But I tried to push there a little bit more and thinking about this forests as more rhizomatic. So my unconscious is not just mine, it's entangled too. So there's something about the unconscious that is not individual. And so to think about that clinical encounter, taking that into account too, of course, this can be super abstract in the here and now. But perhaps the key thing, like to think about the clinical technique of it, is to get out of interpretation, this position of the analyst, which is what we imagine it to be, like you come and say, well, I had a dream about a pen. And then the analyst is like, it's because of that. That gets the forest to be very individual. But perhaps we are thinking about a system of resonances, of opening up words, of inviting a kind of production of metaphors, that you are attuned to it, and you're creating a different language there, opening meaning. It's very subtle, but you occupy a different place there. You're there to facilitate other metaphors from this person that you're working with.
So it sounds like the role of the analyst becomes not to interpret directly, but rather to almost catalyze forms of vibrational moments where that becomes or presents itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly that. Yeah, and you can experience that. Like recently, I was in Brazil in a group doing some fieldwork research, and there's this colleague that do a group psychoanalysis session in the community in São Paulo. There's lots of groups like that, which is cool, for free, obviously, in this amazing kind of community art space where people do lots of workshops, gates are open, people come and go. And in this group, there are people from the same family, their neighbors, people from like all different ages, like 18-year-olds, 70-year-olds, about 15 people, and 2 analysts. And the way the word circulates there, it's very vibrational. And the analyst is there to let it vibrate, not to close it down, but to make contacts, to connect experiences. So something is opened, so there's more air, rather than closing it, frustrating it, alienating you a little bit more so your ego, it's in its own little place, It's not about that utopia. And yeah, for me, that was, for example, one clinical experience that was so clearly co-poetic. That's not the word they were using, but that's what I saw that was happening too.
That sounds super interesting, and I'm really looking forward to sort of reading where your work goes, looking at these kind of vibrational moments in community clinics and how they sort of move outside the boundaries of the usual therapeutic session. And I think that might be a sort of good place, not to finish, but let's say to take a pause. So with that, and maybe as we'll use it as a sort of like one last thought. We can use it to sort of maybe broach some topics that might come up when you do a seminar later in the term. Maybe you could close to thinking a little bit about the relationships of these sort of vibrational moments to the commons, if that works for you. Is that
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really cool point, and I hope to, have lots of time to think about it. But the commons, as you know very well, and some other comrades know very well, has an interesting, I think, genealogy in political philosophy. But perhaps there is a space for us to account for the unconscious there too. To bring the unconscious into the commons. So not forms of organizing, of relationality, of distributing, of being in the land, of imagining this utopia of the commons that is only on the realm of consciousness. But can it be unconscious too? I think that's really cool to think about. I like the idea of the commons that reverberates in Silva Federici, for her definite ecological and feminist demands of our use of this term. Of course, Stefano Harney, Fred Moten, the undercommons. I think that's something really, I think, to me, it was groundbreaking to read that work that you've published, because there's something not neat there, not totalizing, not kind of like this colonial utopia of the commons that is not repeating something like, okay, new form of organization, done, but really one that is always in movement. There's a lot of assumptions in psychoanalytic texts too of the unconscious and the drives being unethical. If only, Stephen, you let people to their own devices, they're gonna kill and fuck their family, they're gonna commit incest, and the world is gonna end. And you think, says who? Says who? That's what the unconscious is about. So are there possibilities of things that are not conscious to be ethical? And this is the work of a lot of post-Deleuzian feminists that think about modes of desire, modes of togetherness that are not reliant on consciousness, but they're reliant on affect. Affect as ethical, as encounter, and not just as this, this view of the subject as this thing that has to be controlled, otherwise, hell. I think it's a particular delirium too, is a delineation of the possibilities of common. And I think that has a lot of political consequences, because if we think that that's what people need to be controlled, then I think we get to particular forms of political organizations that are horrible. So I think you need a different utopia of the drive, of desire, of affect, to have this utopia of the common too. Which is something that I don't develop at length in this book, but I think it's something that we could totally think together. So there's fruitful political dialogues to be had in terms of the unconscious and the commons, for sure.
Cool. Well, with that, I will say thanks for coming along, Anna, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue and thinking together more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for listening, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and see you around.